good afternoon or good evening, I guess, for you, Red. Thank you for joining me for this conversation today. I thought it'd be a good way to start just to ask you to explain a little bit about Filipino Freethinkers, which you helped to found, how the organization came about, how you got involved, and what your personal sort of journey to humanism has been.
So 2009, there were a group of friends, like a very small group. Every Friday and over the weekend, we would have conversations about things that Filipinos in this very conservative country don't normally talk about: philosophy, religion, science, but mostly religion, because this is a very Catholic country. But a bunch of us were exploring atheistic ideas. And after a number of weeks of speaking and exhausting all of our ideas about such topics, we were wondering if there were other groups, because we wanted to add different kinds of slants and angles to the conversation. But we found that there were really none, apart from some groups that we saw online. So there were some Yahoo mailing lists. Very, very interesting to mention that now. Of course, that's a thing of the past. I think they're still good, but mostly people have moved to the social networks.
Yeah, that sounds like a
Anyway,
very retro way of keeping in touch these days.
exactly, exactly. So we reached out to these mailing lists. They had been around for some time, like hundreds of members. And then we asked, like, are there face-to-face meetups where you see each other? It would be cool, in this country of Catholics. Like, are there meetups where physically atheists would see each other? And they said, no, that would be very rare. We would be very lucky if there's a meetup that happens every year, and if more than five people attended, that would be a good thing. And I thought that was such a loss. So I invited people from these various mailing lists to attend a face-to-face meetup. And our first meetup, that was February 1, 2009, we got 26 members in attendance. So that was a
Oh.
minor miracle, if I could say so. And we were so excited that we organized a bunch of events. Of course, we organized the meetup the following week. We organized the very first Filipino Freethinkers Forum. At that first meetup, by the way, that's where we came up with the name. And the name Freethinkers came up because a number of people, they identified not as atheists, but humanists, agnostics, deists, pantheists, and so on. So we were looking for this word that would encapsulate different identities. And we ended up with Freethinker because the focus was more on the way of thinking rather than what you actually thought. And a number of them were humanists, but a lot of people there did not understand or identify like that. So free thinker was the word we ended up with. And of course, I suggested that as well because I like alliteration, like the
Yes,
FF.
it's a cool name.
Yeah, and it makes for a good logo.
Yes.
I don't know if people have checked out our logo, but there's a candle in the middle of it. Like when you put the two F's together, you will see a candle in the middle of that, and it stands for the reason that Carl Sagan, that light in the darkness. So there. It looked like a Philippine flag,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
if you see, there's a candle there. So anyway, that's how it all started for us, and we've been doing a bunch of things since. We've been doing human rights advocacy primarily, a lot of efforts that have nothing to do with atheism, but actually have a lot to do with secularism. So separation of church and state is actually enshrined in the Philippine Constitution, but unfortunately, it's not something that's obeyed by many legislators. So a number of our laws are kind of restricted or regulated by this very strong force of religion, primarily the Catholic religion. So, for example, we still do not have divorce in this country.
Wow, I
Um,
didn't know that.
ab- yeah, abortion is restricted in this country unless it's to save the life of the woman. And that's a bit crucial nowadays because a lot of domestic violence issues amid this pandemic, we have lockdowns, right?
Yes.
And typically women who are trapped in this loveless and very hateful relationships, the violence toward them, they cannot escape because there's no divorce in this country. And we try to push back on these things, right? We are women's rights advocates. We're also LGBT rights advocates. There's no marriage equality in this country. There's a lot of violence toward that community. Of course, trans rights and queer, anything really is quite restricted. And apart from those public advocacy, we also do activities for the community. So a number of those activities, we're very thankful to receive the support of Humanist International. When we do, let's say, Cafe Humanist, we've done a number of those in partnership with Humanist International. We have a regular podcast where we interview a number of people, kind of like this conversation we're having right now. But we've also done a project with Humanist International where we go around Southeast Asia and we compare the situation of different humanists in those different countries, and we call that the Hello Humanists project. And
Which
yeah,
also
we'll
has a very cool logo.
yeah, because it's a humanist logo saying hello. So yep, that's it. We're in the present. We're sharing the situation with most of the world, except for some few lucky countries like New Zealand. Very atheistic country, by the way, led by an agnostic or an atheist. So apart from lucky places like that, we're sharing this very difficult situation.
Yeah, I mean it's an amazing work, and I wonder from the we can post a link to the Hello Humanist series, and it was amazing the different people you spoke to. Looking back on that, did you see any sort of trends that emerged about being a humanist in Southeast Asia? Like, what were the challenges or the opportunities, or well, in particular, if I can be honest, Red, one of the things that motivated me to do these series of conversations was if I think about me and my friends looking at humanism from a European perspective, it obviously has a particular history and so on. And I
Yeah.
know from speaking to people like you and people all over the world that humanism is flourishing in communities around the world, and it can have different flavors and different ways of expressing itself. So what were the key things that emerged from that series?
What I really noticed and appreciated was the diversity, right? In places like the Philippines, it's I call this country and the situation that we're in like the Goldilocks kind of situation, because there's still a lot of work to be done, but you can do that work. You're safe enough to come out and speak in public and even promote it. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement, particularly in legislation, as I've mentioned earlier. But you can do that work. Like, you won't be killed, you won't be abused. Like, you will get frowns, but for the most part, you're safe, right? And then there are countries like, for example, Indonesia, where if you encourage others to become atheists, like, you can go to jail. A friend has gone to jail. Another friend has uh, has moved to Germany and then to the US permanently. He can't ever go back to Indonesia anymore.
Wow.
Or, or you can be killed and hurt in many ways. You can be disowned by your parents and things like this. And then on the other extreme of that, there are countries like Japan or South Korea, where it's so secular. The society is so secular that a lot of the secular people, the humanists, the atheists there, don't feel like they need to have such conversations anymore. So that limits the flourishing of those communities in different ways.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of variety. I'm very lucky to be in this Goldilocks country as far as
Yeah.
promoting humanism. That is, but yeah, that's one thing that I that really stuck out to me in those conversations.
That's really interesting, and it's very interesting what you say about a country like Japan, because there's been a few people from Japan who've been in touch with us over the years. But one thing they say is exactly that: is that Japan almost has a kind of humanistic society in the way that it deals with issues and so on, so that there isn't that need to get together. There's nothing to push against, if you like,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
quite interesting. Yeah.
South Korea was quite unique though, because around that time that we had the conversation with our friend from South Korea, in the video, we featured certain very religious people, like they're fundamentalists that would go out in the streets, and they have this big signs that they wear, and they walk around everywhere with it, and it's no 666 and conspiracies and all that
Wow.
all over there, primarily motivated by religion, right? And they were pushing back against that because even around that time, those groups were promoting very harmful ideas about medicine, for example, about health, that, pseudoscience that really doesn't cure people and makes the harm even worse. And then we read about the case of the super spreaders in South Korea, like this church,
Yes,
and
yes.
yeah, so it kind of puts a spotlight on the need still, even in countries that are supposedly quite secular already. Of course, South Korea is quite a different situation from Japan. I would say that South Korea has it worse than
Mm,
Japan, as I mentioned through those examples.
yeah, yeah. There's another interesting one which I just thought of here, which is China. Now, this is an interesting one because, of course, China, you could probably say, as the country in the world with the largest proportion of atheists. I don't know if that is actually true because I think there's a Eastern European country which actually has almost 100% atheists, but
Hmm.
certainly we can say it's the country with the largest amount of atheists. Um, and so, very often when we at Humanists International publish the Freedom of Thought report, some people will come back to us and say, why do you rank China so low? Because
Yeah,
there's so many atheists there, and we have to kind of explain that humanism and free thinking and stuff. It's not just about not believing in God. In fact, in many
exactly.
cases, that's incidental. It's a consequence
I
of
agree.
being a free thinker. And so I think China is a very interesting one because I don't know if you know, but an organization from China applied to join us in 2017. And long story short, they didn't end up joining. And I think part of it was because of the influence of the Chinese government in all
For sure.
organizations, that they were unable to sign up to a number of our values and policies and things. But I wonder, like, what's your perspective on that, the
Yeah.
Chinese issue?
Yeah, actually, you're very correct. It's a particularly different case from everywhere else. So in studies that I read about religion, they usually make the distinction of organic atheism. So
Ah,
so organic in the sense that people come to it in more free ways, right? The situation in China is, of course, state sanctioned kind of atheism, which is inorganic, which is kind of
yes.
artificial, right? It's kind of forced on you.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, it would be actually interesting to study the differences of places where like you're forced to be an atheist. Like, do you tend to, like, when you have a kind of anti-authoritarian streak, do you take on religion because you want to
Yeah.
be that kind of anti-authoritarian, in the same way that in places where there's a state-sanctioned church, like Church of England, like that kind of thing, where you're kind of pre-registered, like some of your taxes go to funding certain churches. They typically tend to become atheists because they want that kind of freedom.
Yes,
So is it the
yes.
same situation
That's
in
a
China? I'm not
fascinating
sure.
thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's the idea of organic atheism, and I make that distinction, especially when it comes to China.
Yeah. And in actual fact, to take your point one step further, the situation here in the UK is even more absurd that we have unelected church leaders in our legislature passing the laws, which is just absurd. I wonder, you mentioned obviously about the influence of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, which remains very strong, but you also said that the constitution in the Philippines is secular. So is the influence that the Catholic Church exerts in the Philippines largely cultural and social, or does it still have, for example, concordats and legal restrictions?
Yeah, there are still quite political intersections that happen, right? Like most of the elected legislators in the Philippines, they won through displaying a sort of mold that people expected, God fearing, praying all the time, and so on. And it's actually interesting to have a conversation about Duterte, the president right now, because he's been quite openly against the Catholic religion, and he's kind of proven that you don't really have to toe the line all the time. Maybe when you're a populist, so that's a special case, right? But anyway, As far as the laws go, there are certain cases where Catholic representatives are involved in supposedly state activities. Like I'll give some examples, like in like family related, marriage related things. When these decisions are made about how things are run when it comes to marriage licenses, for example, there's a Catholic priest involved, and that doesn't seem correct when it comes to our
Of
state
course.
secularism, right? But that goes all the way back to the history of how secularism was enforced in this country. It was like a bit of Philippine history here. Of course, we were kind of for several centuries under the Spanish rule, and that's what gave us this very strong Catholic background. And we fought for our independence from the Spaniards. But when the Philippine government, the first ever Philippine Congress, had a vote on whether to make our independent constitution a Catholic one or a secular one. The vote was split initially. There were several
Oh.
times that the representatives voted, and it was always split. And it took the brain of the revolution, Mabini is his name, to break that tie, right?
Uh-huh.
So I try to put myself in his shoes, right? What's happening, guys? Like we're trying to gain our freedom, and we're deciding our constitution, and you want to make it a religious constitution. You want to make the Philippines a religious country, and he broke the tie, right? And so he could have celebrated, but the first thing that was done with that secular constitution is to put it on hold. Let's say, okay, let's not have the secular constitution first. The Americans are coming. We have to fight them, and for unity to occur, we need to use that religious background that we had before. Even
Wow.
our history of gaining secularism, it wasn't very clear. So clearly, it's in our kind of past to be very connected to the Catholic Church. A lot of people back then, um, they thought that the Spanish rulers, the people implementing the Catholicism, they had the problem, but the product itself, like it's a pristine product. It's just the salespeople, and it's kind of happening right now. Like a lot of Catholics are still part of the Catholic Church, right? They forget about all of the scandals, like the child abuse scandals, the corruption, and all that, because there's this idea that it's not human people who invented the product; it came down from God, right? But of course, we humanists know that all the way back to the history, it's always people, it's always fallible people who are responsible for this. But we're in that situation that we have right now. So I hope that gives a bit of context
Yeah.
on the situation of secularism, at least the Filipino version of secularism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's fascinating, and it's fascinating how it's bound up, like you say, with the history of the country in that way.
Yeah.
You mentioned as well about the LGBT, LGBTI plus community in the Philippines,
Yeah.
and one of the things which I'm sure it's, you have experienced the same thing, but in doing these conversations with people, one thing is very clear is that the humanists, the free thinkers, and so on, they are always, I think, at the forefront of defending and being allies for the LGBTI plus community. And so, of course, it's no surprise, that very often in communities it's the conservative religious groups which are persecuting LGBTI plus people. So it's no surprise that it's us free thinkers, humanists who are defending them. But I wonder, can you tell me a little bit more about what the situation is like in terms of like what's it life like for LGBTI plus people in the Philippines?
So they're quite represented. I myself identify as queer, but like all of the other identities, and there are many, right? They're quite well represented now when it comes to popular media. Like we have Netflix in the Philippines, so people like Western culture is quite big here. Like we get shows from Thailand or Taiwan where it's like the queer themed ones, like the boys love and all that. So it's quite represented in popular culture. But when it comes to different segments of society, like you will get what you expect, where especially the more marginalized, the more disadvantaged sectors of society, they get violence there. Like you can't be out, like when you're under a roof and then your father is quite misogynistic and you're
Mm.
bound by this macho culture, you get beat up. And one thing that exacerbated that issue actually is this ongoing violence toward people who are identified with drugs, right? Like
Okay.
our country is famous for all of these extrajudicial killings, and I'm very reluctant to kill it a war on drugs, because in a war there are two sides that are fighting. It's more a massacre.
Mm.
It's a massacre on poor people mostly, that they're forced into that kind of a lifestyle, right? And typically they the people who are killed, you know you're eccentric. Let's say you're an eccentric kind of personality, like that's the kind of gender expression that you choose for yourself. And then let's say there's hatred toward gay people, toward queer people. The hatred towards poor and towards people who are involved in drugs, that gets conflated. And then the violence
Okay.
in these sectors of society, like you get poor people just dead lying down on the streets, right? So the hate becomes conflated, and then these things happen. Like
Wow.
a recent case as well was the violence against Jennifer Laude. Like that was a very prominent case. And recently, the Pemberton, the person who was responsible for her death, like he got a full pardon. And of course, there was an outcry from the LGBT, the human rights community, but he got away with impunity. And
Wow.
this government, this administration who was responsible for that gruesome death, they got away with impunity because there are so many other problems. Like this pandemic is, of course, the main thing that's on everyone's minds. And it's kind of, you can only have so much bandwidth. People are so distracted with all of these problems, and who can blame them?
Yeah, of
Like
course.
it really
Yeah.
is quite a tough situation. So the what like not even mentioning those ongoing issues, like the anti-discrimination bill that's been still being fought for, the marriage equality, that a lot of advocates think that we can't even ask for that yet. Let's focus on more low-hanging fruit kinds of
Yeah.
issues.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite stark. You mentioned about COVID-19. What's the situation in the Philippines like? I mean, how is the situation generally, and what is it like for Filipino freethinkers? Is there things you're doing to try and help, or how is it affecting your campaigns?
So COVID-19, I will be a bit fair and say that it could have been really, really bad in this country if we were more like the US. And I'll explain. The most densely populated city in the world is Metro Manila. And when you look at the most densely populated cities in the world list, a number of those cities are in like in the Philippines. So imagine if we had a culture of anti-maskers here.
Yeah.
Or very fortunately, we did not. Like for the most part, people have been doing their best, even though it's very difficult to adhere to social distancing advice from the government. And fortunately, the people who are advising the president on this are more evidence-based than the ones who are advising Trump.
Yeah.
It became a political issue whether you wear a mask or not. At least in the Philippines, that wasn't the case. And at least the president was on the side of wearing masks, of social distancing, and so on. Um, Now, that's only the response to the pandemic itself. The economic situation, though, is quite problematic because that wasn't handled as well as it could have. Of course, when people are hungry, like to hell with this pandemic, I'm going to go out. I need to get food for my family. I need to work. And a large number of the people in already marginalized and already disadvantaged communities are having it really hard. But I guess forcing or looking for silver linings when I say that if we had the anti-masker culture here, it could have been way worse. As
Yeah.
far as how the pandemic is affecting our efforts, one of the things that we're looking at right now is addressing disinformation online, because there's a number of very misinformed people, right? Not as bad as in the US. Like, thankfully, there's the US to look at and say that's how you don't respond to the
Yes.
pandemic. But that's not saying that there are a lot of people who are easily misinformed. And very recently, there was a Facebook news that we have been kind of cyber attacked by China.
Wow.
So a number of actors from China are acting online on the issue of the sovereignty of the West Philippine Sea. So it's kind of a territorial dispute
Uh,
that's been going on between our two countries, and we have been affected by that. Like a hundreds of thousands of Filipinos have been reading this propaganda for up to 5 years now, and it's only been unearthed by Facebook. Now,
wow.
imagine if they had made the topic of the disinformation COVID instead, right?
Mm,
So
mm.
we are quite vulnerable. So one of the things that we've recently put our focus on, and me personally, like an organization that I work with called Engage Media, that's our focus, like that digital rights, all of the ways that we are in danger online, especially because of the pandemic, where most of the world are coming online. Like that's another big focus for us.
That's really interesting, and it's something I don't know if you've seen the new Netflix documentary.
Social dilemma.
Yes. Have you seen
Yeah.
it?
Yes, I have
Uh,
seen it. It's quite a good foot in the door for a lot of
yes.
people, so that we can have these discussions.
Yeah, yeah. I would
Yeah.
like to think that I had some indicate. I've read things about all these different optimizations and the way that people try to gain your attention, your attention industry, and so on. But I think to see it all laid out in the documentary, it is scary. I mean, and
It's very scary.
I think
It's
I'm probably less of a social media user than the average person, but I still find myself drawn to it. And
by
it's
design.
yeah, of course, and
Yeah.
it does make you feel slightly less embarrassed about it when you think that some of the smartest people in the world are being paid a lot of money to try and make sure you keep that app on your phone. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it is truly a terrifying time, and I think the disinformation thing, like you said, and that's another thing which has huge prominence in the United States as well, of course. Um, and
One
we
of the one of the
sorry.
things they don't mention in there is that there's a lot of junk online. There's a lot of conspiracy theory, lots of violence, lots of like gratuitous, like whatever, whether it's related to drugs or sex and all that, and a lot of hate speech. There are people who are hired to clean that up. And these people who are hired, they typically experience a lot of mental, emotional stress. And a lot of them are from the Philippines.
Yes,
So that's, yeah.
I had heard about that because I forget who the person's name is, but one of the directors of that documentary did an interview on the Sam Harris podcast. Sam
Mm.
Harris, I'm less of a fan of these days for various reasons, but the podcast interview with him was very interesting.
Tristan Harris, maybe.
Yes,
Also
yes,
a
that's
Harris.
exactly who it was. That's right.
Yeah.
And he spoke about that, and he called it was like a play on the idea of
Cleaners.
yeah, and it was
The
like a sort of
cleaners, yeah.
exporting your misery basically to people who sit all day
Exactly.
long and have to review videos that have been flagged for the most heinous type of content
Yes.
you can imagine. I mean, the other thing that I've been thinking about recently was I watched the Congress session in the United States where they had the heads
Mm.
of I think it was Google, Facebook, and
Google,
Twitter or something.
uh, GAFAM, like
Yes,
commonly we call them big tech.
yes, 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 the big
Yeah, the
tech
big tech.
leaders.
Yeah.
And I had this just thing of, they kept on trying to say these things to make themselves sound like they were being positive, and they would say things like, we've hired more, officers to help with the running of the US election. And I think they thought that was a good thing. But I thought to myself, hold on a minute, why is this private company, which you and I, they run information for the world now, why are they choosing which staff to appoint to run the US election? I mean, it's just the sense of
It's absurd.
entitlement. It's crazy.
Yeah. It's crazy. And at least in the EU, they have the GDPR, right? That's
Yes,
actually very strong privacy and other digital rights legislation there.
that's right.
But also recently, they've challenged how Facebook has been sending information about EU citizens to the US. And there was this news article as well about Facebook threatening to leave the EU.
Yeah.
So at least there's that. I think Europe is at the forefront of challenging these big tech platforms, and hopefully the rest of the world follows suit.
I hope so. I hope so. And I think the regulations in Europe have been very quite serious. I think they've pushed the idea of digital security and privacy forward quite a lot. But like you say, these companies, because they don't, there's no factory or office building, so they can just pop up everywhere and change their location and all these things. But yeah, well, anyway, that's a fascinating thing to talk about. Yeah. And I guess maybe the sort of last thing I would ask is, in terms of the humanist movement in the Philippines, but also, you've been a member of Humanist International for, over a year and a half or so now. I wonder, what do you think, in terms of your interests in digital security and online and things, what is the future of the humanist movement? Do we have a part to play in trying to advocate to address some of these challenges? What's your optimistic vision for the future?
Well, I think that the way we have approached these issues as the free thinkers, which is we think about the intersections. Like, for example, like I mentioned, women's rights are hindered. We don't have divorce. The reproductive health law took so long to fight for, and we don't even have abortion rights yet. Like the intersection of the lack of secularism in our legislation, right? And of course, humanists tend to gain from more secularism in our legislation. And then LGBT as well, when you think about marriage equality, anti-discrimination legislation, there's an intersection with humanism in there as well. And I think more communities forming and being mindful of these intersections is the way to go. Quite recently, like we've had the LGBT and women's groups sections of the free thinkers for quite some time now. But recently we started a group exclusively for mental health. And this is another Cafe Humanist that we did with Humanist International, where we think about secular support. That's what we called it, secular support for the again the alliteration.
Yes.
Uh, yeah. So it's kind of typically when you talk to psychologists and psychiatrists here in the Philippines, of course they would be quite religious because like as far as statistics go, you would most likely get someone who's religious than not religious. But there are options for secular counsel as well, and that's something that we want to highlight. And also, quite recently, we created a group that's more focused on women issues. And there's a new group that's set up that's exclusively for them. So run by women and like cis trans women, focus on women's issues, and it's a safe space for them. And a lot of them are humanists. And the discussions there are so good and so relevant. Some people who are not humanists, they go in there, but they see, hey, these are free thinkers, these are humanists. They're not as bad as I was told. And then they kind of realize as well, it's not a hard sell. Like you're not forced to be humanists or free thinkers when you join these groups or conversations, but the values are so intersecting and intertwined that like reason, science, and secularism, those are our foundational values. And when you think about the issues affecting women and other minorities, like it's typically a lack of rationality, a lack of science or evidence-based thinking, and a lack of secularism that's causing all this. So I think that the way forward for us is to see how much humanistic issues affect other minority issues and have conversations around that, right? And of
Yeah.
course, uh, like reviewing as well, like the traditional ways of doing things, like culture, like the Bible, like what's told to you in your churches or by your parents and so on, and kind of having more open conversations, like mainstreaming those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very interesting, and I completely can empathize with the point you made about not being exclusivist, to
Yeah,
humanist atheist people, because I think one of the things that I'm always struck by is that, okay, members of the Humanist Association and so on will share a view about the way things are, but we genuinely want people to find fulfillment personally and in their community. And if for them, if that's with religion, then good luck to them.
yeah,
It's about people living their lives with the greatest amount of freedom that they can have, which is compatible with the freedom of others, which is sometimes a balancing act, which, as you say, we have to take all the factors and the different intersections into consideration.
yes, for sure. I 100% agree.
Wonderful. Well, on that note of agreement, is there anything else you would like to say to our members around the world, or any last comments?
I would invite people to check out the Humanist International website. I really love your rebranding, by the way.
Thank you.
Like it's quite like I notice your
Yes, I'm on
headset.
brand with my microphone.
Yeah, that's quite on brand, and yeah, more power to all of your projects. You're doing good work, of course. Check out the Filipino Freethinkers website as well, and of course, the Hello Humanists podcast series. Do check that out. Lots of good conversations there, and of course, this Humanist Prism project that you've started. I will certainly subscribe, and I look forward to more episodes of this.
Thank you very much, Red. It was wonderful to talk to you.
Likewise, thank you.